This land, America, the greatest country in the world. We have a rich heritage of songs and stories about our land and our people.
Come with us on a whirlwind journey and get a musical glimpse of America. Let's start in the great states of the Northeast, where our country had its birth.
Yankee Doodle, Wintertown, mining on a pony.
That Yankee Northeast, the forests of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and the beautiful, charming towns and farms of Vermont. From the shores of Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Maryland's Chesapeake Bay come the best lobster and crab in the land.
But on the beaches of New Jersey, you'll find another national treasure. That's where you'll find Miss America.
From the great state of New York, boasts the spectacular Niagara Falls, the Empire State Building, and the welcoming torch of the Statue of Liberty. While the peal of freedom is still heard from that Liberty Bell in Pennsylvania.
Both states border Lake Erie, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the song of the men on the barges traveling up the Erie Canal.
The serene Shenandoah Valley, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian and Blue Ridge Mountains.
Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland.
Oh, I wish I were in Dixie. Hooray, hooray. In Dixieland, I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie.
Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie.
The beautiful Appalachian Mountains stretch from Virginia and West Virginia through Kentucky, North Carolina, and South Carolina, into Georgia, Alabama, and the down-home state of Louisiana.
Left the critics cold.
What would the South be without the country music born in the hills of Tennessee?
Don't forget the southern state of Arkansas and steamy Mississippi.
Or the southeastern tip of the United States, with its 1,350 miles of coastline, its oranges, its forever sunshine.
And where we plan to retire,
Florida. All aboard through the fields of Missouri, the pastures of Wisconsin, and the forests and lakes of Minnesota. All aboard!
The states of Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana produce American steel and then ship these goods from the Great Lakes to all parts of the world.
To the west stretch the prairies of the central United States, the corn and wheat fields of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas.
Wyoming, Oklahoma, and the Rocky Mountain peaks of Colorado. And how about that yippee-ki state of Texas?
The stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas. The prairie sky is wide and high, deep in the heart of Texas.
Yes, it's the Lone Star State of Texas.
Deep in the heart of Texas. Yeehaw, Texas.
Moving even farther west, we find the hot Chiles in New Mexico,
The Great Salt Lake in Utah,
the breathtaking Grand Canyon in Arizona,
Hoover Dam, and the colorful desert sands and sagebrush of Nevada.
Drifting along with a tumbling tumbleweed. Drifting along with a tumbling tumbleweed. California, here I come. Right back where I started from. And flowers soon in the sun. Each morning at dawn is Birdie singing everything the sun gives me. Say, don't be late. That's why I can hardly wait. Open up that golden gate. California, here I come.
In 1849, news hit the east. Gold had been discovered in Sacramento, California. The gold rush had begun.
And people have been rushing around California ever since.
California, California, here I come. Here I come.
The state of Idaho boasts its potatoes. Washington, its apples. And Oregon, its rugged coastline and forested foothills.
The only two remaining states on our tour are the tropical islands of Hawaii and the rugged state of Alaska.
Altogether, these states from north to south, east to west make up this great land.
A land we thank God for and are proud to claim as our own. For this land is our land, America, the greatest country on earth.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
My name is Terry Casey, and I'm going to be your host tonight as we present America. in the eye of the storm. And I have to ask you a real quick question here. Hasn't this been a marvelous celebration of the greatest country in the world? You bet. And when you think about it, why shouldn't we celebrate? After all, the Lord gave us a land so rich in opportunities, so rich in resources. But what happens when man tries to remove God from his creation? Now, as you ponder that, I want you to meet our first special guest tonight. A young man who, well, he bought into the world's ideas of happiness and fulfillment. Please make welcome Mr. Keith Carter.
I grew up just north of Atlanta, Georgia, in Marietta. And looking back on those years, I can look back and see that I grew up in a pretty normal home. Had two wonderful parents, and I can even remember when I was 10 years old, and it was a Wednesday evening, and my mom had attended this little Bible study. And she came home for this Bible study, and she sat my brother and my sister and myself down, and she told us, she said, look, tonight I've invited Jesus Christ into my heart. And her life was changed. And it was through her testimony, through her witness, that not a month later, my dad went to this little Bible study. And his life was changed. So for the first time in my family's life, we got plugged into this little church and started going to the youth group. And it was one Sunday evening that God really started dealing with me. At this time, I was 11 years old. And I remember I came home that night and climbed up in my parents' bed around 11 o'clock, and I said, Mom and Dad, would you pray with me to receive Jesus Christ? And of course, they said yes. And so I remember I got plugged into that little youth group, and everything started going pretty good. It was about a year or so after that, though, we found out that we were moving. And we transferred from Marietta, Georgia to Dallas, Texas. And I remember I made the move, the transition, and those of you who have started in a new school, you may know the feeling. I didn't know anyone. Didn't have a friend in the whole school. And I remember the whole first week of school, I would go and I would sit in the lunchroom by myself because I didn't know anyone. Sit there and alone in the classroom, didn't know anyone. Then something really interesting happened at the end of that first week of school. I remember it was the end of the day, getting ready to go home. And in this school, like so many schools all across America, they had all the different cliques. They had the kids who were into the drugs and the alcohol, and they were labeled the freaks or the hippies. They had the kids who were into athletics, they were labeled the jocks. Then they had the socials and the preppies and the nerds. And in Texas, they had the group that wore the big cowboy hats, the big belt buckles, the boots, had the skull can rings on their back pockets. In Texas, they were called ropers or cowboys. You know what we call them in Georgia? Rednecks. So they had all these different cliques. And I was someone who enjoyed athletics, so I was labeled a jock. And I'll never forget what this girl said to me. It was something that was so direct. I remember she looked directly at me and she pointed her finger at me and she said, you don't want to be a jock. You want to be one of us. I remember it caught me off guard. I even went home and told my folks about it, and they warned me. They said, Keith, stay away. Don't get involved. Well, I had a problem. I wanted friends like every teenager wanted friends. I started hanging out with the athletes, but you know what I found out? Many of them were doing just as many drugs, drinking just as much. And it wasn't too much longer after that. It was a Friday evening. A friend invited me over to his house. And a friend of mine pulled out a marijuana joint and he said, here, Keith, try it. And I said, I don't want to mess with it. He said, come on, Keith. He said, what's the big deal? Try it. I said, no, I don't want any part of it. He said, come on, Keith. He said, try it. So at the age of 13, I had a choice. What was I going to do? And so at the age of 13, I started experimenting. And folks, it was like I took my relationship with Jesus Christ and I put it on a shelf. And at that point in time in my life, my friends started becoming more important to me than anything. More important than my relationship with my parents, relationship with Christ, more important than anything. Well, my junior in high school, I came back to Georgia, and I remember thinking this will be a great time to make some changes in your life. Get around a new group. But again, I started hanging out with the athletes. The drugs, the alcohol continued. And by this time, I was on a downward slide towards tragedy. All this led to eventually one night in my senior year in high school. It was on April the 15th of 1983. I'll never forget that day. It was a Friday morning. A friend had come into school and started spreading word that he was having this huge party. He said, look, my parents are leaving for the weekend. I have the whole house to myself. I'm having a party all weekend. A word spread throughout the school. That night arrived, and it seemed like half the school had showed up at my friend's house. Just about everybody who was there had been drinking, many of them drunk. I had been drinking that night. About an hour or so after the party got underway, another friend of mine showed up, and he came in and he was visibly upset. You could tell something was wrong. This guy came walking up to me and said, look, Keith, I'm going to find a guy that stood up my sister. It was a guy that he didn't like, so he thought he'd take matters into his own hands and go and find the guy who was at this other party. He said, Keith, would you go? I agreed to go. He talked to several other guys. We jumped into a couple of cars and we headed down to this neighborhood party several miles away. When we arrived at this other party, there were about 60 or so kids gathered out in this cul-de-sac. They had been drinking. Immediately, two of the guys that were with us jumped out of the cars and ran ahead and began exchanging words with the students at this other party. Just the fact that we were there, words were exchanged, and all of a sudden, small fights began to break out all over. I remember I got into the middle of things, and all of a sudden, I got hit in the back of the head. Then I got hit again from the front. And so in an attempt to get the guy in front off of me, I reached in my pocket and I pulled out a pocket knife. I lunged forward, and when I did, I stabbed the guy in front one time in the leg. When I did, my momentum carried me to the ground, and I remember getting up, seeing big piles of people, then all of a sudden I looked and I saw my friends taking off and running back to the cars, hollering, get out of here, Keith, let's go. I jumped up and I ran with them. Made it back to the car, headed back over to my friend's house, went in. We'd been beat up pretty bad, so we just kind of patched our wounds and continued on like nothing had taken place. Spent the night at my friend's house. But the next morning, the police arrived. They began to take everybody downtown for questioning. Except me and several others were left behind. It's about an hour or so after that, I received this phone call from my football coach. And my coach called me on the phone and he asked me, he said, Keith, he said, tell me everything that took place last night. I heard there was a fight. I told him about the fight and he went on to tell me, he said, Keith, I heard that there were knives. Who had knives? I told him that I had a knife and several of the other guys that I knew had knives. He said, Keith, who used the knife? I said, well, I used a knife last night. I stabbed somebody in the leg one time. He said, Keith, we got to talk. I'm coming over. He came over to my friend's house. We went walking out in the front yard. And he looked at me again. He said, Keith, tell me everything that took place. I went through the whole story again. Then he looked at me and he said this. He said, Keith, somebody died last night and the police want to talk to you. What do you want to do? I told him that I would go and I would talk to the police. He said, I'll take you. We jumped into his car and immediately he took me down to Cobb County Police Department. I walked in the door and they really weren't even looking for me, and told them who I was, and they said, come back later. We've been interviewing people all night. I said, well, you don't understand. I said I was involved in the fight last night and I'd stabbed someone. Of course, their ears perked up and they said, come with me, son. And they took me to this back room and started questioning me. It lasted about 30 minutes or so. They got up and they left. They came back about 15 minutes later, and I'll never forget their words. I was sitting down at this table and staring at the wall in front of me, and my coach was over here to my right. And as soon as they came in the door, they broke the silence, and one of them looked down at me and he pointed his finger at me and he said, young man, we're charging you with a murder. I looked over at my coach and I saw a tear running down his eye. I looked back up at the detective. I said, what are you talking about? What do you mean? One of them laughed and said, son, in the state of Georgia, that can mean the death penalty or life in prison. From there, we had to go and call my parents and tell them what had taken place. And folks, I'll never forget leaning against the wall of the Cobb County Jail, looking down this hallway, and all of a sudden, from a distance, I could hear someone who was broken, who was upset. And I looked, and coming around the corner, it was my mom. She was devastated. She could barely walk. My coach and my dad had to hold her up. I remember I ran to her, and we were both in tears, and I looked over her shoulder, and for the first time in my life, I saw my dad cry. It wasn't just tears. No, he was bawling. He was devastated. And young people, right then I realized that my choices, that my decisions, that they weren't only affecting my life, but they were affecting the people I loved, my parents. My choices were destroying their lives. From there, I was booked and I was charged with murder one. I was taken over to the Cobb County Jail, and I remember I came off the 4th floor of the Cobb County Jail, and as soon as I did, this deputy pointed down to this mattress. He said, pick up that mattress and follow me. There's a rolled up mattress on the floor, and so I picked it up and I put it on my shoulder, and I started following him. He stuck his keys in one set of doors and he opened them up and went right into the middle of the jail. The whole room was filled with smoke and it smelled like an old locker room. You could hear the guys screaming back and forth. Walked right through the middle of that, then he stuck his keys in another door, and it was a 6-inch steel door. And he opened it up, and about 12 feet away, there was another steel door closed on the other side. And my cell was right there to the left. He stuck his keys in the bars and he rolled them back, and I walked in. He slammed them behind me and he left. And folks, I remember I walked over and I started rolling out that mattress. And right in the corner of that little bunk bed, there was a little New Testament Bible, the kind that Gideon's passed out. And I remember I picked up that Bible and I started thumbing through the pages and I just broke into tears. You see, folks, that little Bible was a reminder to me of the way things could have been. And I started thinking back on my life, all the opportunities and the chances I had to change. The many times I would sit in a church service and I'd feel so convicted because of the life that I was living. I would want to go forward, but I was sitting next to a friend and I was embarrassed to lift my hand, embarrassed of what they would think. And then there was one particular weekend I was invited on this retreat with a Young Life group up to Windy Gap, North Carolina. Went up there for the weekend, had a great time, and they gathered us together though that Saturday night. And folks, I can't remember anything that the pastor said except what he said at the end. He looked at each one of us in the eyes and he said this. He said, "Who is Lord of your life? What is Lord of your life?" Then he challenged us. He said, "I want you to leave this place, go find a quiet place all by yourself and ask yourself that question, who is Lord of your life? What is Lord of your life?" And he said, "Guys, listen to this. If God's calling you to respond to his call, then you respond to his call tonight." And I remember I left that little chapel and went out and found this little quiet place, and I was sitting there and I was thinking back over my life. See, folks, I knew that Jesus was my Savior, but you know what I realized? He wasn't first in my life. He wasn't the Lord of my life. There was a lot of other things that were in front of my relationship with Jesus Christ. I was thinking about what he had said. God was calling me to him to make a change. All of a sudden, a friend came walking up and said, Keith. I looked up, we started talking, walked back in and left that weekend never having rededicated my life. When God was calling me to him, I didn't have the guts to tell him to get away. But I was thinking about what the pastor had said. This was about 1 month before all this had taken place. And folks, I remember lying in that cell and thinking, you know what, Keith, you've blown it with God. That God surely won't forgive you. God can't forgive you. But thumbing through the pages of that little Bible, there was a verse in 1 John 1:9 that I came across. That said, if you confess your sins, he's faithful and just to forgive you of all your sins and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. And I remember that day on April the 16th of 1983, just praying a simple prayer. God, if you can forgive me right now. And folks, I'm happy to say it was like Jesus Christ himself stepped out of heaven. He penetrated the walls of the Cobb County Jail. He penetrated those 6-inch steel doors. And that day on April the 16th of 1983, he penetrated my heart and set me free from the prison of sin. The prison that I had so built for years. You know, folks, I wish I could stand here today and tell you, because I changed, that everything worked out just fine. But when there's sin, there's always consequence. And young people, I brought this uniform today to hopefully illustrate a point. I wanted you to see something. I want you to realize this. He's Alex Silly standing up here in a prison uniform in chains. But see, long before I ever had to put on a physical prison uniform, was put into a physical prison and was put into chains, I was locked up. You might be saying, well, Keith, what are you talking about? You were locked up. You see, at age 13, when I started selling out to sin, I started locking myself up. And you know what? That prison is more real than any physical prison that you can be in. And you know what breaks my heart is this, as we look across America, that there's so many young people who are walking around in a lot of school hallways who are locking themselves up. Sure, they're not walking around in a uniform like this in chains, but the prison is just as real. It's more real, in fact. And the only one that can set you free is Jesus Christ. He can set you free from the prison of sin and release you from the sin that locks so many teenagers up. But I do wish I could stand here and say, you know what? Because I changed, everything worked out. But young people, I want you to know this. When there's sin, there's always consequence. And some consequences had to be paid. And I ended up spending right at 34 days before being released out on bond, getting ready to go to trial. And let me stop here and hopefully clear up something for some of you. You may be thinking, stabbed the guy in the leg one time, how did that kill him? Well, the fact of the matter was this. He was stabbed more than once. But in my heart and mind, I know and I believe that I only stabbed him one time in the leg, that other people had to be involved. And it was later on that we found out there were other people involved. But you know what? Because of that night and the choices I made, I deserved everything that I got. And as a result of that night, I ended up receiving a 20-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter. Then going to a prison in North Georgia. I'll never forget the day I was taken up there. I was escorted with a bunch of other guys on our old school bus. We're headed up I-85 and 985 to the Georgia mountains. And I remember there's a lot of goofing off, a lot of joking. All of a sudden we came rolling over this hill and from a distance you could see the prison. All of a sudden a hush came over that whole bus and fear started creeping up into everyone's hearts. I realized where we were going. One by one, they escorted us off in chains and sat us down in these chairs and shaved our head and deliced us. Took everything from us, even took our name and replaced that with a number. And the number they gave me was EF 161254. From there, we'd spent 6 weeks in this isolation dorm. And I remember I was there for just a couple of days, and one evening I walked over, I was looking out the bars, and all of a sudden I saw this prisoner on top of this building. This guy took off running across this building, ran, jumped, cleared the fence, hit the ground on the other side, and kept on running. Another one followed him, did the same. A third one wasn't so lucky, though. When he jumped, he didn't clear the fence, but he landed on top and he got tangled up in the razor wire and the barbed wire. By the time he freed himself and he hit the ground on the other side, the guard in the tower was alerted and he shot him, and he fell to the ground. And I remember sitting there seeing this and thinking to myself, this can't be real. This can't be happening. This is stuff you see on TV. But it was real. And prison was a very real place. And it was a very violent place. I remember seeing brutal beatings and such. I'm going to sit here and tell you stories about prison. But all I know is this, that long before those young people, including myself, ever put on this uniform and put on those chains, we had sold out to sin. And it had wrecked and destroyed our lives. And we were locked up in here long before we were ever locked up physically. Folks, after being in there about 6 months, I received the most devastating news I could have ever received. It was worse than ever being charged with murder one. And I'll never forget that day. It was a Saturday, and they'd call me to the visiting room. So I went in, and from a distance, I could see my parents who were sitting at this table. I was excited to see them, but the closer I got, I could read their faces and tell that something was wrong. The closer I got to them, I looked, and I could see tears well up in their eyes. And I sat down, and I said, Mom and Dad, tell me what's going on. What's the matter? They looked at me, and their heads dropped, and they had to tell me that my father had been diagnosed with cancer. And he only had 6 months to live. I remember we spent 2 hours together that day struggling, trying to hold back the tears, because in prison you just didn't cry. It was a sign of weakness and didn't want the other guys to see. And in order to cry, you'd have to wait late at night and pull the covers up over your head or wait till you were in the shower so the water would hide your tears. And I remember I went back to my dorm that night, and I waited till late that night, and I pulled the covers up over my head, and I just broke into tears. And I remember crying out to God, God, don't take his life, take mine. He deserves to live. I'm the one that deserves to die. My father fought off the cancer for about 1.5 years before it took its toll on his life. And I'll never forget the day of February of 1985, and it was very late at night, and I was lying there, and all of a sudden I heard the guard. He shouted throughout the bar, he said, Carter, get to the front. And I walked to the front, and he looked at me, and he said, the chaplain wants to see you. And the minute he said that, my heart sank. The chaplain just didn't come and see you at night. I knew it was probably my dad. I walked into the chaplain's office. I said, it's my dad, isn't it? The chaplain dropped his head and said, yeah, Keith, it doesn't look good. He went on to tell me that my father had gone into a coma. Probably wouldn't even make it through the night. But he said, Keith, if he makes it through the night, we're going to let you go and see your father in the morning. He said, your mom's over at the hospital. Call her and tell her that you're coming to see him. Picked up the phone and called her at Northside Hospital. She picked up the phone, and as soon as she did, she said, Keith, your dad came out of the coma about an hour ago. Do you want to talk to him? Of course, I said yes. Spoke to my father on the phone. At the end of the conversation, I told him, I said, Dad, I'm coming to see you tomorrow. We hung up the phone, and my father looked directly at my mom, and he said this. He said, Rosemary, don't let me fall asleep. Keith's coming to see me tomorrow. You see, he was afraid that if he fell asleep, he might go back into a coma and we'd never see each other again. The next day, they took me to Northside Hospital, and I remember walking in there, and I was in prison stripes just like this in chains. And I was so embarrassed and so humiliated, I couldn't even look up. I just stared at the floor and followed the guard. I finally made it to my dad's room. My mom met us at the door. She saw that I was in chains and shackles. She begged the guard. She said, please don't let Larry see Keith in chains. My dad had spoke up, and he said, Rosemary, it's okay. I just want to see my son. I wasn't prepared for what I was about to see. The cancer so taken over his life, he was just skin and bones. You could barely even recognize him. But folks, I'll never forget what he did. They took me over and they sat me down right beside his bed. And my dad, with all his strength, he reached out and he grabbed my handcuffed hands. And he said these words. He said, son, I love you and I'm proud of you. I love you and I'm proud of you. Folks, how could he be proud of me? I'd wrecked and destroyed my life. I'd sold out to the world. I'd sold out to sin. How could he be proud of me? Well, you see, I didn't realize it too much later on what he was talking about. You see, he wasn't proud of what he saw on the outside. He saw dirty stripes and chains. But he was proud that I'd finally made the right choice on the inside. The choice to be free. The choice to be free from the sin that had wrecked and destroyed my life. You see, young people, I'm convinced of this one thing. The people who really love you, that's your parents, that's your grandparents, that's your pastor, your youth pastor, that's your true friends. The people who really love you, you know what? They want you to be free. They want you to be free. But you know what? It's not their choice. It's a choice only you can make. And my challenge to you tonight is this, that you'll choose freedom. We're talking about a United States where we have freedom. But true freedom is only found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And young people, Jesus Christ holds the key. And I want to challenge you that if you're in any kind of prison tonight, whatever it may be, Jesus Christ can set you free from the prison of sin. God bless you.
Sent down his son to die upon the cross. Jesus walked up Calvary's hill to rescue us from loss. Well, it was not something we deserved, no way that we could buy. Oh, the mercy of our loving God. But the Father heard our cry and gave us mercy. God gave us mercy when just in time He sent His Son to suffer and to die, to give us mercy. God gave us mercy. Oh, and now the chains of sin and death are broken by His mercy. God's sweet mercy. Just like a man who stands before the King upon his throne, here I stand condemned to die for all the wrongs I've done. Well, I cannot cover up my sin. No way to justify. Oh, but it's not for justice that I plead, but for mercy, Lord, I cry. Oh, and He gave me mercy. God gave me mercy. Oh, when just in time He sent His Son to suffer and to die, to give me mercy. are broken. God's precious mercy, oh, and just in time He sent His Son to suffer and to die, to give me mercy. God gave us mercy.
Her name is Gracie Rosenberger, and she's no ordinary athlete because Gracie is a double amputee.
I joined Gracie here at the Classic Rock Gym in Nashville, Tennessee, where we did some rock climbing. And I'll tell you, it was not easy because consider that most of your strength comes from your legs, and for Gracie, that is just not an option.
For me, it represents the past 15 years of everything I was ever told I couldn't do. When I get to the top, I'm like, yes.
Gracie has always been determined to accomplish big things. The story of her conversion is as unusual as her life. Her aunt was a friend of Holocaust survivor Corrie ten Boom. One Christmas, 6-year-old Gracie insisted on delivering Miss ten Boom's Christmas present.
After I handed her the gift and she said, "Is Jesus your friend?" in a very thick Dutch accent, I was afraid to say no, but I've been asking how he can be my friend. I've been asking my pastor, and they feel like I'm not old enough and that kind of thing.
That day, Gracie accepted the gift of salvation. Growing up into a teenager, Gracie thought she knew exactly how her life would turn out.
I had my whole life planned out. I knew when I was going to get married. I knew when I wanted to have children, how many children I wanted to have, where I wanted to live, what I wanted to do.
She had no idea then that a tragedy would threaten her life and dreams. She was a freshman vocal performance major at Belmont College in 1983. On the morning of November 18th, despite her parents' warning, she got in the car to visit her childhood voice teacher.
They had called me back a second time and said, "You sound too tired. You really shouldn't go on the strip. We really don't think you should go." And I said, "Nothing's going to happen to me." Those were my exact words. Nothing's going to happen to me.
Overcome with fatigue, Gracie couldn't keep her eyes open. Her car sped out of control. When she nodded off, her car struck an abutment, then flipped into a small ravine. A mile marker thrust through her seat, mercilessly tearing it in half. The engine burst into flames.
I remember thinking, I can't move my body and I can't get out of here. I'm stuck here. And I realized at that point, I was going to die unless the Lord intervened.
Nearly a dozen truckers rushed to extinguish the blaze. Gracie was in grave condition. Her legs crushed and pushed over her shoulders. The paramedics rushed her to the hospital. She had lost so much blood that her blood pressure was 40/20. Her chance of survival was slim. Surgeons immediately went to work to save her life. Once they got her stabilized, they began the long task of helping Gracie recover.
I felt like my life was over. I had so many dreams. I came to Nashville with the idea and the firm belief that I've always wanted to be a Christian singer. The last thing I prayed was, "Lord, make me into the woman you want me to be," and this is where this got me. I felt like he's rejected me, he's forgotten.
24 surgeries and 2 years later, a broken Gracie met and married Peter Rosenberger.
I lived in this utopia, like marriage was going to fix my pain, and then having children was going to fix my pain, or surgery was going to, something was going to make it go away.
But the pain continued to gnaw away at her pelvis, legs, and back.
And to be face-to-face with someone who suffered as greatly as she suffered, and as the pain continued to increase and dominate her life, I became more and more indignant with God. That's a word I use kind of carefully, but at the same time I was very angry with God for not stepping into this thing.
I felt like I was losing my life, just little by little, that it was being taken away from me.
I think it was roughly about her 50th operation or around there. And I said, how much more does this woman have to go through before your purpose has completed this thing? I accept the fact that you died on the cross, the salvation of all mankind, but you obviously do not care about this. And I don't believe that you're involved in our daily lives. When I finally admitted what was in my heart, that crisis of belief that was there, that was the beginning of healing for me.
In 1988, Gracie and Peter had their first child, Parker. Grayson followed 4 years later. But the joy of being a mother was overshadowed by the constant pain in her legs.
My quality of life was just, I cannot describe to you except to say, this came into my mind, what it's like to be in so much pain that you have to crawl down the hall because it hurts too much to walk. That's when it got to that point when I said, amputation is looking better. I mean, anything's got to be better than this. And I knew there was no surgery, miracle surgery cure and I kept praying for God to instantaneously heal me. And it didn't come when I wanted it and how I wanted it. And so that's when I called him and I said, I can't take it anymore.
Gracie's heartbreaking decision to amputate her legs. Her right leg was taken in 1991. 4 years later, her left leg was amputated. Ironically, losing her legs became her salvation.
I take them off at night and put them on in the morning. I thought I'd never be able to go on walks with my boys. I would never be able to play basketball or get out and pitch with my sons. And really, this sounds completely off the map, but that has been my miracle. That is the miracle. And I am a much wholer person today than I ever was with 2 legs.
She exudes more life than any other woman I've ever met in my life. I've never seen such courage and strength, and she's totally unaware of it. It's so natural for her to go snow skiing, whereas most people would be afraid to face life with any type of limitations, much less having both legs removed. I try to shy away from calling her Amazing Gracie. It's just too easy, but it's a lot of pride to watch her do these things.
I don't feel like I'm a courageous person. I feel like I'm just a person who wants to live. Live. L-I-V-E. I don't want to just exist on a plane of coping.
This determined, positive attitude landed Gracie a cover story in Recovered magazine. Gracie and Peter share their inspiring testimony with other amputees and also in churches.
People come up and say, oh, well, look at the testimony. Who wants this kind of testimony? Nobody wants that. I don't have to understand all this stuff. I'm in sales, not management. I mean, I don't need to know all these things. It's not important. Important thing is I know that he is trustworthy because of what he did at the cross. That kind of love warrants that kind of trust.
Now, when I get up in front of a congregation or an audience, I think this is what I always intended on doing, but I just didn't intend on doing it with a broken body and not 2 legs. Therefore, I can boast all the more gladly of my difficulties so that Christ's power can rest on me. I want to live. If I'm going to live, I'm going to sing, I'm going to tell, I'm going to do everything within my power to try to show my family that God is who he says he is. I don't feel like that's courageous. I feel like I've been given back life and I want to live it.
Makes you think about the definition most of us attach to living, doesn't it? What do you say? How would you like to meet her? Please welcome Gracie Rosenberger. No, thank you. No, you stay right there. You love that applause, don't you? What a wonderful story. Thank you for that. I got to ask you, though, I feel a little funny hugging you like that. Who's this guy over here?
That's my husband. That's Crazy Peter.
Peter, major part in her life. Thank you, sir. Peter said he agreed to come out here and say, okay, if you want to introduce me, if you have to introduce me, all right, but then I'm getting out of here. He's gone. Thank you, Peter. This lady is so cool. She's so great. She has got a wonderful sense of humor, and she can bend your ear for, what, hour after hour after hour after hour after hour, day after day. There are, I guess to get a little more serious, there are so many different kinds of pain. There are so many different kinds of hurt, so many different levels of intensity of pain, hurt, frustration. There's physical pain, obviously, the things you described in your story, but also the pain of frustration. There's the thought that would creep into anybody's mind, too, where I would think, at some point, that's enough, I want to quit. So I want to ask you, based on all of these things, with all the different kinds of pain, and all of us feel pain to one extent or another, whether it's isolation, pain, maybe not as the intensity of yours, but it's there, mental or physical. What is the one thing that you would say to folks, whether they be disabled, whether they be teenagers who are hurting because mom and dad don't understand them, and they're thinking about suicide, there's so much teen suicide, whether it be folks who from the outside, doesn't look like there's anything wrong with them at all, but their heart hurts. What is the one thing that you would say to address those hurts?
You would ask a question like that.
I figured you met so many challenges and overcome them, that would be a piece of cake.
Well, I tell you, I would definitely say God's grace is sufficient. There's no doubt about that. You've seen Keith's testimony previously. Yes, thank you for whoever planned this so that I could get up here after him, after crying my eyes out and try to get up here now, you know. But God is bigger than the prison doors. He is bigger than the funeral home. He's bigger than divorce court. He is bigger than the hospital room. He is bigger than sickness. He is bigger than death. He is bigger than all of those things. And even when you don't think you have the faith, it doesn't take big faith. The word says it's only a mustard seed that can move mountains. It's a belief in a big, big God.
That pretty much sums it up. God is great, God is good. You know, we've learned that since we were kids, but there's a reality to that, isn't there? Well, God has given you so many blessings, not the least of which is just for us to be here to listen to you and to see you. But I also happen to know that He has blessed you with a marvelous voice, and I wonder if you would share that with us.
I would be honored.
Gracie, thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. There will be times when your peace can't be found. You cry for help, yet you hear back no sound.
you feel there's no one on whom you can rely. You think your battle's lost, so why try? Why even try? But in the midst of the valley, you will see the light. You think you are alone, but then just look again in the midst of the valley, in the midst of your valley, there he stands, a friend. Keep faith and hope, oh, close to your heart, 'cause they'll guide your steps when the valley gets dark, and when you feel you just can't go on, that's when you will feel